In the vast wilderness of the 1870s American frontier, survival meant making hard choices that could haunt you forever. When Clara Whitmore refused the crude advances of her wagon train's leader, she never imagined it would cost her everything. Cast out into the unforgiving wilderness to die alone, this quiet widow carried nothing but her grief and an iron will that wouldn't bend. 3 days without water, 2 nights fighting off wolves, 1 moment from death when fate intervened. Elias. Monroe wasn't looking for companionship when he found her collapsed body near his ranch. The wealthy cattle baron had spent years avoiding human connection, haunted by ghosts from the war and the mysterious circumstances of his wife's death. But something in Clara's defiant spirit called to the hope he thought was buried forever. What happens when 2 broken souls discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana territory as Clara Whitmore adjusted her worn woolen shawl against the crisp autumn air. She had been traveling with the Hartwell wagon train for 3 months now, ever since leaving her small Iowa farm behind after Thomas's death. The consumption had taken him slowly, leaving her with memories of a gentle man who had promised her a life of quiet contentment and little else. No children had blessed their union, though they had tried for 7 years. Now, at 32, Clara found herself among strangers, carrying what remained of her life in a single trunk and a carpet bag. The wagon train consisted of 43 souls when they had departed Council Bluffs. Disease, accidents, and the harsh realities of frontier travel had reduced their numbers to 31. Clara had watched families bury children along the trail, seen men broken by the endless miles, and women aged beyond their years by grief and hardship. Through it all, she had maintained her quiet dignity, offering comfort where she could, and keeping her own counsel when the whiskey flowed and tongues loosened around the evening fires. Jacob Stern commanded the wagon train with the authority of a man who had made this journey twice before. Broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, he wore his experience like a badge of honor, regaling anyone who would listen with tales of previous expeditions. His beard, streaked with premature gray, framed a face that might have been handsome. Once before, years of hard living and harder choices had carved deep lines around his eyes. Clara had noticed how those eyes lingered on her whenever she moved about the camp. "Mrs. Whitmore," he had said just that morning, approaching her wagon as she prepared breakfast over the small fire. "I've been thinking about your situation." Clara had continued, stirring the cornmeal mush, not looking up. "I wasn't aware I had a situation, Mr. Stern. A woman alone on the frontier faces challenges that a man might not fully appreciate." His voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to having his opinions valued. "Winter's coming on, and we're still 6 weeks from the valley. A woman needs protection, needs someone to look after her interests." She finally raised her eyes to meet his. "I've managed well enough so far." "That you have," he agreed, but his smile held something that made her skin crawl. "But managing and thriving are different things entirely. I've been thinking that perhaps we might come to an arrangement that would benefit us both." Clara set down her wooden spoon and straightened to her full height, which brought her eyes level with his chin. "What sort of arrangement?" "The kind that would ensure your comfort and safety for the remainder of our journey and beyond." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "I'm a man of means, Mrs. Whitmore. I have land waiting in the valley, plans for a future that could include the right woman." The proposal hung in the air between them like smoke from a badly tended fire. Clara had received similar offers twice before during the journey, once from a widower with 4 children, and once from a bachelor whose hands shook from drink. She had declined both with politeness and firmness, but something in Jacob Stern's manner suggested he would not accept refusal as easily as the others had. "Mr. Stern," she said carefully, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I must decline. I have my own plans for the future." His smile faded slightly. "Plans that don't include the security a husband could provide? Plans that don't require me to marry for convenience." The morning routine of the wagon train continued around them. Children gathered dried buffalo chips for fuel while their mothers prepared breakfast. Men checked harnesses and studied the sky for signs of weather. No one paid attention to the conversation between the wagon master and the quiet widow, but Clara felt exposed nonetheless. "I see." Stern's voice had grown cooler. "Well, I hope you'll reconsider. The trail ahead grows more dangerous with each mile. A woman alone might find herself in circumstances where convenience becomes necessity." That evening, as the wagons circled for the night, Clara noticed the change in how others treated her. Conversations stopped when she approached. The women who had previously included her in their evening sewing circles found reasons to be elsewhere. Even the children seemed to avoid her wagon. Only Martha Caldwell, a kind woman traveling with her husband and 3 young sons, made an effort to speak with her. "Pay them no mind," Martha whispered, as they gathered water from the nearby creek. "Stern's been filling ears with talk about your prideful ways. Says you think yourself too good for honest partnership." Clara knelt beside the stream, watching the clear water flow over smooth stones. The sound reminded her of the creek that ran behind the farm she had shared with Thomas. He had proposed to her beside a similar stream, nervous and earnest, his hat in his hands. She had accepted because she cared for him, because he was decent and kind, and because her options as a spinster of 25 had been limited. Their marriage had been built on respect and gentle affection, if not passionate love. "I don't think myself too good for anything," Clara said quietly, "but I won't accept less than I deserve either." Martha glanced around to ensure they were alone. "Jacob Stern isn't a man who accepts no easily. My husband says he's been asking questions about your circumstances, about whether you have family waiting for you in Oregon." "I have cousins in Portland," Clara replied, though she hadn't heard from them in years and wasn't certain they would welcome her. "Good. That's good." Martha's relief was evident. "A woman needs somewhere to go. Someone to claim her if things go poorly." The next morning brought news that would change everything. Samuel Morrison, one of the scouts, rode into camp with word that a bridge ahead had been washed out by early autumn rains. The detour would add 2 weeks to their journey, pushing them perilously close to the season's first snows. Tempers that had been simmering throughout the long journey finally boiled over. "We can't afford the delay," argued Henry Caldwell, Martha's husband. "Winter storms in the mountains kill more pioneers than all the Indians and wild animals combined. The alternative is trying to ford a river that's running high and fast." Morrison replied, "I've seen what that river can do. It's claimed more than 1 wagon train." Jacob Stern listened to the debate with the patience of a man who had already made his decision. When the voices finally died down, he spoke with quiet authority. "We'll take the river crossing. We have good men and strong teams. With proper preparation, we can make it safely." Clara said nothing during the discussion, but she felt a growing unease. The men's faces were tight with worry, the women's eyes dark with fear. This was the moment when leadership mattered most, when experience and wisdom should guide decision-making. Instead, she saw stubbornness and pride driving them toward unnecessary risk. 3 days later, they reached the swollen river. The water ran muddy and swift, carrying debris from the mountains. Clara watched as the first wagon attempted the crossing, saw it nearly swept away before the oxen found purchase on the far bank. The women and children were pale with terror, the men grim with determination. It was then that Jacob Stern approached her wagon for the last time. "Last chance, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the river's roar. "Accept my protection now, or face the consequences of your pride." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I'll take my chances with the river." His smile was cold as winter wind. I'm afraid that won't be possible. The decision came swift and merciless as a winter storm. Jacob Stern gathered the remaining families around the evening fire, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority as he laid out Clara's fate. We have difficult choices ahead, he began, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. The river crossing will test every soul among us, and we cannot afford to carry dead weight. Clara felt the eyes of her fellow travelers upon her, some curious, others uncomfortable. Martha Caldwell refused to meet her gaze, while her husband Henry studied his boots with unusual intensity. Only young Timothy Morrison, the scout's 15-year-old son, looked at her with something approaching sympathy. Mrs. Whitmore has made her position clear, Stern continued, his tone reasonable despite the cruelty of his words. She prefers independence to the safety of partnership. Very well, independence she shall have. The hastily scrawled note he produced from his coat pocket would haunt Clara's dreams for months to come. Written on a torn piece of ledger paper, it spelled out the wagon train's justified decision in language that made abandonment sound like mercy. Due to Mrs. Clara Whitmore's repeated refusal to accept proper guidance and her unwillingness to contribute to the collective welfare of our party, it has been decided that she shall be left to pursue her own path. This decision has been reached after careful consideration of the safety and well-being of all members of our company. We leave her with her personal effects and provisions, trusting in divine providence to guide her journey. The paper was signed by Jacob Stern as wagon master, witnessed by Henry Caldwell and 2 other men whose courage had failed them when tested. You can't mean this. Martha Caldwell finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She's done nothing. Wrong. She's done nothing right either, Stern replied coldly. A woman who won't accept protection becomes a burden to those around her. We have children to think of, families to preserve. Clara stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. The simple gold band on her finger caught the firelight, and she twisted it once, drawing strength from the memory of the man who had placed it there. Thomas had been gentle, but he had also been brave when circumstances demanded it. She would not shame his memory by begging. Very well, she said, her voice carrying farther than she had intended. I accept your decision. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of the river. Even Stern seemed taken aback by her calm acceptance. You'll be given your personal belongings, he said, as if conferring a great favor. Food for 3 days, a blanket. How generous, Clara replied, and several people winced at the quiet steel in her voice. They left her at dawn, while the morning mist still clung to the valley floor. Clara stood beside her meager pile of possessions and watched the wagon train disappear into the distance, following the river toward what she hoped would be their safe crossing. She did not wave, did not call out. She simply stood and watched until the last wagon vanished from sight. The silence that followed was unlike anything she had ever experienced. On the farm with Thomas, there had always been the sounds of livestock, the whisper of wind through grain fields, the distant voices of neighbors. Here, in the vast emptiness of the Montana Territory, she was alone with a silence so complete it seemed to press against her ears. Her inventory was pitiful. A carpet bag containing 2 changes of clothing, her Bible, and a few personal items. A woolen blanket that had seen better days. A small sack of cornmeal, another of dried beans, and a piece of salt pork that wouldn't last more than 2 meals. A tin cup and plate, a knife that was more useful for cutting vegetables than defending herself. Most precious of all, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth that contained her sewing kit and the few coins she had managed to save. The first day was the hardest, not because of physical hardship, but because of the crushing weight of solitude. Clara had never been truly alone before. Even as a child, she had shared a bed with her sisters. Marriage to Thomas had meant constant companionship, and the wagon train had provided the comfort of community, however flawed. Now, for the first Time in her 32 years, she was entirely dependent on herself. She followed the river, reasoning that water was life, and that the wagon train's route might eventually lead to settlement. The walking was difficult across the uneven ground, and her city boots were poorly suited to the terrain. By evening, her feet were blistered, and her shoulders ached from carrying her burdens. The first night was a revelation in fear. Every sound in the darkness seemed magnified, every shadow a potential threat. Clara had heard the men's stories around the campfire, tales of wolves and mountain lions, of hostile Indians and desperate outlaws. She built a small fire using the few matches she possessed, more for comfort than warmth, and sat with her back against a large boulder, the knife clutched in her hand. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the howl of wolves in the distance and the rustle of unseen creatures in the brush. When dawn finally broke, Clara was exhausted but alive, and she felt the first stirring of something that might have been pride. The second day brought new challenges. The river curved away from the direction she needed to travel, forcing her to choose between the security of water and the hope of finding help. She chose to follow the river, a decision that would save her life. Her food was already running low, and she supplemented it with berries she recognized from her childhood, testing each one carefully before eating. It was on the second night that she encountered the wolves. She had made camp in a small clearing, exhausted from the day's travel and dizzy from hunger. The fire was smaller than she would have liked, her supply of matches dwindling, but it provided some measure of comfort. She was dozing fitfully when the howling began. Closer than it had been the night before, they appeared at the edge of the firelight like shadows given form, their eyes reflecting the flames. Clara counted at least 5, possibly more lurking. In the darkness beyond her vision, her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for the knife, knowing it would be useless against so many predators. The pack leader, a massive grey wolf with scars across his muzzle, stepped into the light. Clara forced herself to remain still, remembering stories she had heard about wolves, how they could sense fear and weakness. She met the animal's gaze steadily, her grip tight on the knife handle. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they regarded each other across the dying fire. Clara's arm ached from holding the knife. Her throat was dry with terror, but she did not look away. Finally, perhaps sensing that she would not be easy prey, the pack leader turned and melted back into the darkness. The others followed, leaving Clara alone with her racing heart and the dying embers of her fire. She did not sleep again that night. The third day brought Clara to the edge of delirium. The meager food was gone, her water nearly exhausted, and the blisters on her feet had broken and begun to fester. She stumbled more than walked, following the river through a landscape that seemed to mock her with its indifferent beauty. The autumn colors that had once seemed lovely now appeared garish. The clear sky, a cruel reminder of the harsh sun that beat down upon her. It was late afternoon when she finally collapsed. Her legs simply gave out, and she found herself on her knees. Beside the river, too weak to rise, the water was clear and cold, and she drank deeply, knowing that it might be her last taste of anything in this world. The fever that had been building throughout the day finally claimed her. Clara's vision blurred, and she saw faces in the moving water. Thomas beckoning her to join him, her mother long dead reaching out with loving arms, even Jacob Stern smiling with cruel satisfaction. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. She was dying when Elias Monroe found her. He had been riding the boundary of his property, checking for strays and enjoying the crisp autumn air, when he spotted what he first took to be a bundle of discarded clothing beside the river. It was only when he drew closer that he realized it was a woman, unconscious and barely breathing. Elias was a man who had learned to be cautious of strangers. His wealth made him a target, and his isolation made him vulnerable. But something about the woman's stillness, the way her hand clutched a small bundle, even in unconsciousness, stirred something in him that he had thought long dead. He dismounted slowly, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip, out of habit rather than genuine suspicion. The woman was clearly no threat to anyone, least of all him. Her face was pale and drawn, her lips cracked from dehydration. But even in her extremity, he could see the strength in her features, the stubborn set of her jaw that suggested she had not given up easily. "Ma'am?" he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Clara's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and bright with fever. She tried to speak, but only a whisper emerged. "Please, easy now," Elias said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You're safe. I'm going to help you." He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was, how fragile she felt in his arms. Her head fell against his shoulder, and he caught the faint scent of lavender water despite her. Days in the wilderness. It was a civilized smell, a reminder that this woman had once lived a different life than the one that had brought her to this desolate place. As he carried her toward his horse, Elias Monroe had no idea that he was rescuing more than just a dying woman. He was saving the person who would finally teach him how to live again. Clara awoke to the unfamiliar comfort of clean sheets and the distant sound of men's voices drifting through an open window. For a moment she lay still, trying to piece together where she was and how she had arrived there. The last clear memory was of kneeling beside the river, accepting that death might be a merciful end to her ordeal. The room around her was simple but well-appointed, with whitewashed walls and sturdy furniture that spoke of quality craftsmanship. Sunlight streamed through gingham curtains, and she could smell coffee brewing somewhere in the house. Most remarkably, she was clean. Someone had washed away the grime of her wilderness ordeal and dressed her in a soft cotton nightgown that was too large for her frame. The door opened quietly, and a woman of perhaps 50 entered carrying a tray. She was plump and motherly, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. Her dress was practical but well-made, and she moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for others. "Ah, you're awake," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Clara couldn't quite place. "I'm Maria Santos, Mr. Monroe's housekeeper. How are you feeling, child?" Clara tried to sit up and discovered that her body was weak as a newborn colt's. "Better," she managed, though her voice was still hoarse. "How long have I been here?" "3. "In days," Maria replied, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Mr. Monroe found you by the river, more dead than alive. You've been burning with fever, talking in your sleep about wagon trains and wolves." The memories rushed back then, and Clara closed her eyes against the pain of them. The abandonment, the terrifying nights alone, the crushing weight of solitude. When she opened her eyes again, Maria was studying her with gentle concern. "I don't remember much after collapsing by the river," Clara admitted. "This Mr. Monroe, he brought me here, carried you himself," Maria confirmed, pouring tea from a delicate china pot. "Nearly worked himself to death nursing you through the Viva, sat up with you 2 nights running, cooling your forehead with wet cloths and making sure you took water." Clara accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. The tea was perfectly brewed, neither too strong nor too weak, and she could taste honey sweetening it. "That was very kind of him. I'm afraid I have no way to repay such kindness." Maria's expression grew stern. "Mr. Monroe doesn't help folks. Expecting payment, child? He's a good man. Though life's been hard on him, you just focus on getting your strength back." Over the next few days, Clara began to explore the boundaries of her recovery. The house was larger than any she had ever lived in, with wide hallways and high ceilings that spoke of prosperity. Through her bedroom window she could see rolling pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, and in the distance, mountains rose, like sleeping giants against the sky. It was on her 4th day that she finally encountered her rescuer face to face. She had managed to dress herself in clothes that Maria had provided, a simple brown dress that was only slightly too large, and was attempting to make herself useful by folding the linens that had been brought to her room when a knock came at the door. "Come in!" she called, expecting Maria with another meal. Instead, a man entered who took her breath away with his quiet presence. Elias Munro was tall and lean, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who spent time outdoors, but there was something in his expression that spoke of deeper storms weathered within. He wore simple ranch clothes, wool pants, a cotton shirt, and boots that showed honest wear, but he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice deep and carefully modulated, "I'm glad to see you on your feet. I'm Elias Munro." Clara set down the linens and smoothed her skirt, suddenly conscious of her appearance. "Mr. Munro, I owe you my life. I don't know how to begin to thank you." He waved away her gratitude with a gesture that suggested discomfort with praise. "Any decent person would have done the same. The question is, what happens now? You've been through an ordeal that would have broken many people. Do you have family? Somewhere to go?" The directness of his question caught her off guard, though. She appreciated it more than false politeness might have managed. "I have cousins in Portland. Though I haven't spoken with them in years, I'm not certain they would welcome an unexpected relative." Elias nodded thoughtfully. "Portland is still weeks away and winter's coming on fast. The passes will be snowed in before long." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "You're welcome to stay here until spring if you'd like. Maria could use help with the household, and we have more space than we need." Clara studied his face, looking for hidden motives or expectations. She had learned to be wary of men offering help, but something in Elias Munro's manner suggested genuine concern rather than self-interest. "I wouldn't want to be a burden." "You wouldn't be," he replied simply. "This ranch runs on mutual help and honest work. If you're willing to earn your keep, you're welcome to stay." That evening, Clara insisted on helping Maria prepare dinner, despite the older woman's protests. Her hands shook slightly from weakness, but she found comfort in the familiar motions of kneading biscuit dough and chopping vegetables. Cooking had always been a source of satisfaction for her, a way of caring for others that required no words. "You don't need to prove anything, child," Maria said gently as Clara shaped the biscuits with careful precision. "Mr. Munro didn't invite you to stay because he needs another cook. Then why did he?" Clara asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Maria was quiet for a long moment, her hands never pausing in their work. "That man has been alone too long," she finally said. "Oh, he has the ranch hands and me, but it's not the same thing. He's been carrying grief like a stone in his chest, and I think maybe seeing your courage reminded him what it means to hope." Clara looked through the kitchen window toward the barn, where she could see Elias talking with two of his men. Even from a distance, she could sense something isolated about him, a wall that held the world at arm's length. "What happened to his wife?" "Eleanor died 3 years ago," Maria replied, her voice soft with old sorrow. "Sweet girl, though fragile as spun glass. She wasn't made for frontier life, but she tried. The fever took her one winter when the doctor couldn't get through the snow. The dinner table that evening was an exercise in careful courtesy. Elias ate with the precise manners of a man who had been taught proper behavior, asking polite questions about Clara's recovery and avoiding anything that might touch on difficult subjects. Clara found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the way his eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the present moment. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, hoping to draw him into safer conversation. "How long have you been here?" His face relaxed slightly. 8 years. I bought the land from a man who couldn't make a go of it. Built most of the buildings myself with help from the hands. We run about 2,000 head of cattle, sell beef to the army posts and the mining camps. "It must be satisfying work," Clara observed, "building something lasting." For a moment, his guard dropped completely, and she saw passion kindle in his eyes. "It is. There's something about taking raw land and making it productive, creating something that will outlast you." Then the walls went back up, and he turned the conversation to more mundane matters. Later that evening, Clara sat on the porch with her sewing kit in her lap, mending a tear in one of her 2 remaining dresses by lamplight. The night air was crisp with the promise of winter, and she could hear cattle lowing in the distance. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something approaching peace. Elias emerged from the house and settled into a chair nearby, a cup of coffee in his hands. "Nice evening," he said quietly. "Beautiful," Clara agreed, looking up at stars more brilliant than any she had seen during her months of travel. "I've never lived anywhere so quiet." "Does the quiet bother you?" "Some people find it unsettling." Clara considered the question seriously. "No, after months of being surrounded by people, I find I appreciate the space to think." She paused in her sewing. "Though I suppose I've had more solitude recently than I care to repeat. Maria told me you were abandoned by your wagon train." His voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the anger beneath it. "That's a hard thing for decent people to do. Their leader made it clear that my refusal to accept his partnership made me a burden to the group." Clara kept her voice steady, though the memory still stung. Perhaps they were right. A woman alone is a responsibility that others shouldn't have to bear. Elias was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if she had said something wrong. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a conviction that surprised her. "A person's worth isn't measured by how convenient they are for others. Anyone who would abandon a woman in the wilderness isn't fit to lead a church picnic, much less a wagon train." The fierce protectiveness in his tone warmed her more than she cared to admit. "Thank you for that," she said softly. They sat in comfortable silence after that, 2 people who had learned that words weren't always necessary for understanding. Clara found herself stealing glances at his profile in the lamplight, noting the strength in his jaw and the way his hands held his coffee cup with unconscious grace. There was something about Elias Munro that spoke to a part of her she had thought buried with Thomas. Not the desperate need for security that Jacob Stern had tried to exploit, but something deeper and more dangerous. When she finally rose to go inside, he stood as well, the gesture automatic and courteous. "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore. I hope you sleep well." "Good night, Mr. Munro, and thank you again for everything." As she prepared for bed in the comfortable room that was becoming familiar, Clara allowed herself to consider the possibility that her ordeal might have led her to something better than mere survival. For the first time in months, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The October mornings had grown cold enough to frost the windows, and Clara found herself waking earlier each day, drawn by the peaceful rhythm of ranch life. She had been at the Monroe Ranch for nearly 2 weeks now, and the routine had become as comfortable as an old quilt. Maria would already be in the kitchen when Clara arrived, the coffee pot brewing and breakfast preparations underway. "You don't need to rise so early, child," Maria would say each morning, but Clara could see the pleasure in the older woman's eyes at having company during the quiet morning hours. "I like the early mornings," Clara would reply, and it was true. There was something restorative about watching the sun rise over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold while the world was still hushed with sleep. It was during one of these peaceful mornings that Elias opened his heart to her, though neither of them recognized it as such at the time. Clara was sitting on the porch with her second cup of coffee, watching the ranch hands prepare for the day's work, when Elias emerged from the barn leading a magnificent bay mare. The horse was clearly well-bred, with elegant lines and a coat that gleamed like polished mahogany in the morning light. "She's beautiful," Clara said as he approached the porch. Elias paused, his hand resting on the mare's neck. "This is Belle. She belonged to my wife." His voice carried a weight that made Clara's chest tighten with sympathy. "I haven't ridden her since Eleanor died. Couldn't bring myself to somehow." Clara set down her coffee cup and rose slowly, understanding that this moment required careful handling. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the horse. He nodded, stepping back slightly. Clara approached Belle with the confidence born of a childhood spent around farm animals. The mare whickered softly and allowed Clara to stroke her neck, clearly starved for attention and affection. "She's lonely," Clara observed quietly. "Horses need companionship, purpose. She wants to be useful again." Elias was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Eleanor wasn't much of a rider. She was afraid of horses, actually, but she insisted on learning because she thought it was expected of a rancher's wife. Belle was chosen for her gentle temperament, and now she spends her days in a stall, growing restless and sad, Clara said, running her hand along the mare's shoulder. "That's no life for such a beautiful creature." "No," Elias agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. "It isn't." Clara looked up at him, seeing past his carefully controlled exterior to the man beneath. "Would you like me to exercise her? I'm a competent rider, and I think we might both benefit from the activity." For a moment, she thought he would refuse. The offer clearly touched on something deeply personal, a grief that he guarded carefully. Then something shifted in his expression, and he nodded slowly. "I think Eleanor would have liked that," he said. That afternoon, Clara rode Belle across the rolling pastures surrounding the ranch house, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly free. The mare was responsive and eager, clearly delighted to stretch her legs and feel the wind in her mane. Clara had forgotten the joy of riding, the sense of partnership between horse and rider that made them something greater than the sum of their parts. When she returned to the barn, Elias was waiting for her, his expression unreadable. "How did she handle?" he asked as Clara dismounted. "Like a dream," Clara replied honestly. "She's been well trained, and she has heart. With regular exercise, she'll be magnificent again." Elias nodded, but Clara could see that he was struggling with emotions he wasn't ready to voice. She busied herself with removing Belle's bridle, giving him space to process whatever he was feeling. "Clara," he said finally, and her heart skipped at his use of her given name. "Would you join me for dinner tonight? Just the two of us. There are things I think we should discuss." The evening meal was served in the smaller dining room, with candles flickering on the polished table, and Maria's best china gleaming in the soft light. Clara had chosen her blue dress, the nicer of her two remaining garments, and had taken extra care with her hair. She told herself it was simply proper courtesy, but she knew she was lying. Elias had clearly made an effort as well. He wore a clean white shirt with a string tie, and his hair was still damp from washing. He looked handsome and nervous, like a young man calling on a girl for the first time. "Thank you for riding Belle today," he said, as Maria served roasted chicken with herbs from her kitchen garden. "It meant more than you might realize." "She needed it," Clara replied simply, "and so did I. I haven't ridden in months." "You ride well. Where did you learn?" "My father kept horses on our farm in Iowa. Nothing as fine as Belle, but good, honest, working stock. He believed that anyone who lived on a farm should know how to handle horses." Clara smiled at the memory. "I was riding before I could properly walk, according to my mother." Elias poured wine from a bottle that looked expensive, his movements careful and deliberate. "Tell me about your husband," he said quietly, "if you don't mind speaking of him." Clara was surprised by the request, but she found that she didn't mind. "Thomas was a good man, quiet, thoughtful, kind to everyone he met. He was older than me by 8 years, already established when we married. He had a small farm, raised corn, and kept a few head of cattle." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It was a peaceful life, but not an easy one. The work was constant, and the rewards were modest." "Did you love him?" The question was asked so quietly that Clara almost missed it. She considered lying, offering the expected platitudes about marital affection. Instead, she found herself telling the truth. "I cared for him deeply. He was patient with me, respectful, never raised his voice or his hand. But love, the kind of love that sets your soul on fire." She shook her head slowly. "No, I think we both knew that what we had was partnership more than passion." Elias was quiet for a long moment, turning his wineglass in his hands. "Eleanor and I married for love," he said finally. "At least, I thought we did. Looking back, I wonder if what I felt was more about rescue than romance. She was so fragile, so in need of protection. I wanted to be her knight in shining armor. And were you?" His laugh was bitter. "I tried to be, but you can't protect someone from life itself, from the simple hardships of existing in a place like this. Every winter was a battle for her, every storm a crisis. She grew thinner and more fragile each year, until it seemed like she might blow away in a strong wind." Clara heard the guilt in his voice, the weight of responsibility that he still carried. "You can't blame yourself for her death, Elias. Sometimes people are simply not made for the lives they find themselves living." "Can't I?" He met her eyes directly. "I brought her here, to this isolated place. I knew she was delicate, but I thought love would be enough to sustain her. I was wrong. Love is never wrong," Clara said firmly. "The circumstances might be difficult. The timing might be poor, but love itself is never a mistake." He studied her face in the candlelight, and Clara felt something shift between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities that neither was quite ready to voice. "You're a remarkable woman, Clara Whitmore, stronger than you know, and you're a good man who's been carrying guilt that isn't his to bear," she replied. Eleanor was lucky to have someone who loved her so deeply, even if the world proved too harsh for her. The conversation moved to safer topics after that. The ranch, the coming winter, Clara's observations about ranch life. But underneath the polite discourse, Clara sensed currents of something deeper, more dangerous. When Elias walked her to her room that night, his hand briefly touched hers, and the contact sent warmth spreading up her arm. "Good night, Clara," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Good night, Elias." She lay awake, long into the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what was happening to her. She had thought herself beyond such feelings, assumed that her capacity for romantic love had been buried with Thomas. But there was something about Elias Munro that called to parts of her she had forgotten existed. The next morning brought disturbing news. Samuel Morrison, the same scout who had warned the wagon train about the washed-out bridge, rode into the ranch with word from town. The Hartwell wagon train had attempted the river crossing, and disaster had followed. "Lost 3 wagons, and 7 souls," Morrison reported grimly, "including Jacob Stern himself. River took him when he tried to save a family's livestock. Ironic, considering how quick he was to abandon others." Clara felt no satisfaction at the news of Stern's death, only a deep sadness for the lives lost and the families torn apart. But she couldn't help wondering what might have happened if she had been with them, if her presence might have somehow changed the outcome. "Don't," Elias said quietly, reading her thoughts with uncomfortable accuracy. "Don't blame yourself for surviving when others didn't. Stern made his choices, and they led to consequences he couldn't foresee." That evening, Clara found herself drawn to her writing desk, a beautiful piece that Elias had provided for her use. She pulled out a sheet of paper and began composing a letter she had been avoiding for weeks, a letter to her cousins in Portland, explaining her circumstances and asking about the possibility of joining them in the spring. But as she wrote, Clara found herself describing the ranch, the beauty of the mountains, the satisfaction of useful work. She wrote about Maria's kindness and the pleasure of riding Belle across the open pastures. Most tellingly, she found herself writing about Elias Munro, his quiet strength, his generous heart, the way he had given her not just shelter, but a chance to rediscover herself. When she read over what she had written, Clara realized that it sounded less like a request for refuge and more like a description of a woman who had found her home. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. She set the letter aside, unfinished, and prepared for bed with the growing certainty that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Outside her window, the first snow of the season began to fall. covering the world in pristine white and ensuring that, for better or worse, she would be staying at the Monroe Ranch until spring. December arrived with a vengeance, blanketing the ranch in snow that transformed the landscape into something from a fairy tale. Clara had never experienced a winter quite like this one. The cold was fierce but clean, and the silence that settled over the land was profound and peaceful. She found herself thriving in ways that surprised her, growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. The work had become second nature to her now. She rose before dawn to help Maria with breakfast, spent her mornings on household tasks, and devoted her afternoons to projects that brought her deep satisfaction. She had taken over much of the mending and sewing for the ranch hands, finding genuine pleasure in the rhythm of needle through fabric. Most of all, she had become an integral part of the ranch's daily operations in ways both large and small. It was during one of these snowy mornings that Elias made an observation that would change everything between them. Clara was in the kitchen, carefully embroidering initials onto a new set of work shirts she had sewn for the ranch hands. The winter had given her time for detailed work, and she took pride in the neat, precise stitches that marked each garment with its owner's name. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice Elias watching her from the doorway until he spoke. "You've been doing beautiful work," he said, his voice warm with genuine appreciation. "The men appreciate having clothes that fit properly, that are made with care." Clara looked up from her embroidery, her cheeks warming under his praise. "It's satisfying work. I like being useful." Elias stepped into the kitchen, accepting a cup of coffee from Maria before settling into the chair across from Clara. "You've done more than make yourself useful. You've made this place feel like a home again." The statement hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Clara bent her head back to her work, but she could feel his eyes on her, studying her face in the morning light. "I've been thinking," Elias continued, his voice carefully measured, "about making some changes to the ranch brand." Clara's needle paused in its path through the fabric. The Monroe Ranch brand was a simple EM contained within a circle. Elias. Monroe's initials, marking everything he owned. It was a symbol of his independence, his solitary authority over everything within his domain. "What kind of changes?" she asked, not daring to look up. "I was thinking about incorporating another initial, making it more inclusive." His words were chosen carefully, but Clara could hear the vulnerability beneath them. "If you would be amenable to such a change." The embroidery hoop trembled slightly in Clara's hands. She understood what he was really asking, the commitment implicit in altering a ranch brand. A brand was more than a mark of ownership. It was a statement of identity, of permanence, of belonging. "That's a very generous offer," she said quietly. "But are you certain it's what you want? Such changes can't be undone easily." "Nothing worthwhile is ever easy to undo," Elias replied. "The question is whether you would want your initial included. Whether you see yourself as part of this place permanently." Clara finally raised her eyes to meet his, and what she saw there took her breath away. Gone was the careful distance he had maintained since her arrival. In its place was something raw and hopeful, a man laying his heart bare, despite the risk of rejection. "I would be honored," she said simply. The smile that spread across Elias's face was like sunrise after a long night. "Then we'll have the new brand iron made in the spring. EM and CW intertwined, a symbol of partnership." "Partnership," Clara repeated, tasting the word. It held so much more promise than the hollow arrangements that had been offered to her before. That afternoon, Clara found herself helping Elias with the ranch accounts, a task that Eleanor had never been able to master. Clara's neat handwriting and careful attention to detail made quick work of organizing the ledgers that had grown somewhat chaotic during the busy autumn months. "You have a head for numbers," Elias observed, watching her tally columns with practiced efficiency. "Did you keep books for your husband's farm?" "Thomas wasn't comfortable with figures," Clara admitted. "He was wonderful with growing things." with understanding soil and weather and livestock, but the business side of farming eluded him. I found I enjoyed the precision of it, the way everything had to balance perfectly. Eleanor found the accounts overwhelming, Elias said quietly. She would become anxious just looking at the ledgers, convinced she would make some terrible error that would ruin us. He paused, his pen hovering over the page. It's remarkable how different two people can be, how they can complement each other in unexpected ways. Clara understood that he was comparing her to his late wife, but she felt no jealousy, only sadness for a woman who had struggled to find her place in a world that demanded strength she didn't possess. Eleanor sounds like she was a gentle soul. The world can be hard on gentle souls. Yes, Elias agreed, but it can be equally hard on strong souls in different ways. The difference is that strong souls tend to survive it. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a neighbor, Ben Hartley, who owned the smaller ranch to the east. Hartley was a weathered man in his 50s, with graying hair and suspicious eyes that seemed to take in everything and approve of little. He had clearly ridden hard through the snow, and his horse was steaming in the cold air. "Monroe," he said without preamble, as Elias stepped onto the porch, "we need to talk. Come inside, Ben. Warm yourself by the fire." Elias's hospitality was automatic, but Clara could sense his wariness. Hartley stamped the snow from his boots and followed Elias into the main room, where Clara was still working on the accounts. His eyes settled on her with undisguised curiosity and something that might have been disapproval. "This is Mrs. Whitmore," Elias said, his voice carrying a subtle warning. "She's been staying with us through the winter." "So I've heard," Hartley replied, his tone neutral but his meaning clear. "Folks in town have been talking." Clara felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her eyes on her work. She had expected this eventually, the speculation, the gossip, the judgment of people who saw impropriety in any arrangement that didn't fit their narrow definitions of respectability. "What exactly are they saying?" Elias's voice had grown dangerously quiet. "Nothing specific," Hartley backtracked, clearly recognizing that he had overstepped. "Just wondering about the situation, you understand. A man and a woman, unmarried, living under the same roof. Mrs. Whitmore is a guest in my home," Elias said firmly. "She was abandoned by her wagon train and nearly died before I found her. Any decent person would have done the same." "Of course," Hartley agreed quickly. "I'm not suggesting anything improper. It's just that people talk. And sometimes that talk can cause problems for everyone involved." Clara set down her pen and rose gracefully from her chair. "Perhaps I should leave you gentlemen to your discussion," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "That's not necessary," Elias said, but Clara was already gathering her things. "I think it is," she replied quietly. "Mr. Hartley came here to speak with you about ranch business, not to make polite conversation with me." She left the room with her dignity intact, but once she reached the privacy of her bedroom, she sank into a chair and let the full weight of her situation settle over her. She had been so comfortable, so content with the life she was building at the ranch, that she had forgotten how her presence might appear to others. The implied criticism in Hartley's words stung more than she cared to admit. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. "Clara?" Elias's voice was gentle but concerned. "May I come in?" She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his face tight with anger and something that might have been embarrassment. "I'm sorry about that," he said without preamble. "Hartley had no right to suggest anything improper about your staying here." "But he's not wrong, is he?" Clara asked quietly. "About how it appears to others? A single woman living in a bachelor's household, even with Maria here as chaperone." Elias stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a decisive click. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." She nodded, though her heart was racing. "Do you care what people like Ben Hartley think about you? About us?" Clara considered the question seriously, weighing her words. "I care about propriety. about maintaining my reputation. But more than that, I care about your reputation. You've been nothing but honorable in your treatment of me, and I won't have your kindness repaid with gossip and speculation. Then marry me, he said simply. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Clara felt the world tilt on its axis, everything she thought she understood suddenly uncertain. Elias. I know it's sudden, he continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them out before his courage failed. I know we haven't talked about love or romance or any of the things that usually precede such a proposal, but we work well together, Clara. We understand each other. We could build something real here, something lasting. Clara sat down heavily, on the edge of her bed, her mind reeling. You're talking about a marriage of convenience. I'm talking about a partnership between two people who respect each other, who enjoy each other's company, who share common goals and values. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. I won't lie and say I'm offering you passionate love. I'm not sure I'm capable of that anymore. But I'm offering you security, companionship, a place where you belong, a chance to build something together. Clara looked down at their joined hands, noting how right they looked together, how his calloused fingers complemented her smaller ones. And what would you gain from such an arrangement? A partner, he said simply, someone to share the burdens and the joys, someone who understands the value of honest work and simple pleasures, someone who makes this house feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. It was a practical proposal, logical and reasonable. Clara found herself surprised by how much it appealed to her, this offer of partnership without the complications of passionate emotion. She had experienced the pain of loss once. Perhaps there was something to be said for building a life on steadier foundations. May I have time to consider your proposal? She asked finally. Of course, Elias replied, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. Take all the time you need. After he left, Clara sat alone in her room as darkness fell outside her window. The snow continued to fall, covering the world in pristine white, and she found herself thinking about fresh starts and second chances. The practical part of her mind catalogued the advantages of Elias's proposal: security, respect, a home where she was valued and useful. The romantic part of her heart whispered that she was settling for less than she deserved, that somewhere out there might be a love that would set her soul on fire. But as she sat in the comfortable chair in the warm room of the house where she had found refuge, Clara began to wonder if perhaps what she had found here was more valuable than passion. Perhaps what she and Elias could build together would be stronger and more enduring than the fleeting fire of romantic love. The decision, she realized, was hers to make. Clara's answer came not in words, but in actions, unfolding over the course of the following weeks like a flower opening to spring sun. She began by quietly rearranging her belongings, moving some of her personal items to the main living areas of the house where they might be seen and appreciated by Elias. Her mother's small silver mirror found its way to the mantelpiece in the sitting room, and her father's worn leather Bible took its place on the bookshelf beside Elias's collection of agricultural journals. The changes were subtle but significant, and Elias noticed each one with the careful attention of a man learning to hope again. When Clara placed her embroidered tablecloth on the dining room table, replacing the plain one that had served there since Eleanor's death, he said nothing but smiled with quiet satisfaction at breakfast. It brings warmth to the room, Maria observed approvingly, running her fingers along the delicate stitching. This house has needed a woman's touch for too long. Clara found herself slipping into the role of ranch wife with surprising ease. She took over the planning of meals, consulted with Elias about household purchases, and began making small improvements that reflected her own taste while respecting the existing character of the house. Most significantly, she started wearing Thomas's wedding ring on her right hand instead of her left, a gesture that did not go unnoticed. It was during one of their evening conversations that Clara finally addressed the proposal directly, though, characteristically, she approached it from an unexpected angle. "I've been thinking about your late wife," she said, as they sat before the fire, she with her mending and he with a book of cattle breeding records, "about what kind of wife she was to you." Elias looked up from his reading, his expression guarded. "What about her? You loved her deeply, but you said yourself that what you felt was more about rescue than romance. You wanted to protect her, to shield her from the harsh realities of this life." Clara's needle moved steadily through the fabric as she spoke. "I think I understand now why that kind of love became a burden for both of you. Eleanor wasn't strong enough for this life," Elias said quietly. "I should have realized that before I brought her here." "Perhaps," Clara agreed. "But I think the real problem was that you felt responsible for making her happy, for ensuring that she never faced difficulty or discomfort. That's an impossible task, Elias. No one can protect another person from life itself." Elias set aside his book, giving her his full attention. "What are you saying?" Clara looked up from her sewing, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm saying that I'm not Eleanor. I don't need to be rescued or protected from the realities of frontier life. I've faced hardship before, and I've survived it. What I need is a partner, someone who will stand beside me rather than in front of me. And do you think I could be that kind of partner?" The question was asked with careful neutrality, but Clara could hear the vulnerability beneath it. "I think you already are," she replied simply. "You've never treated me as fragile or helpless. You've given me work to do, responsibilities to shoulder, decisions to make. You've trusted me to be strong enough to handle whatever comes our way." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "I cared for Eleanor, but I think I was in love with the idea of her, the beautiful, delicate woman who needed my protection. With you, it's different. I see who you really are, and that person is someone I genuinely admire and respect." "And I see who you really are," Clara replied. "Not just the successful rancher or the war hero, but the man who sits up all night with a sick calf, who remembers every ranch hand's family circumstances, who reads poetry when he thinks no one is watching." They had somehow moved closer together during the conversation, and Clara was acutely aware of Elias's proximity, the warmth radiating from his body, the way the firelight caught the silver in his hair. When he reached out to touch her cheek, and she didn't pull away. "Clara," he said softly, "I want to try again. Not the desperate protective love I felt for Eleanor, but something steadier, more honest, something built on who we really are rather than who we think we should be." "Yes," she whispered, and the words seemed to release something that had been held in careful check between them. The kiss that followed was gentle but sure, the kiss of two people who had found something unexpected and precious. When they broke apart, Clara felt as if the world had shifted on its axis, revealing new possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. "We should talk to Reverend Miller about performing the ceremony," Elias said practically, though his voice was still rough with emotion. "And we'll need to get word to your cousins in Portland, let them know about the change in your circumstances." Clara nodded, though the mention of her cousins brought a pang of uncertainty. She had never finished the letter she had started months ago, and she wondered what they would think of her decision to marry a man they had never met, to make her home in a place they had never seen. "There's something else we need to discuss," she said carefully. "The town, the neighbors. Some people will always see our marriage as hasty, improper. They may never fully accept me as your wife." Elias's expression hardened. "Let them think what they want. Anyone whose opinion matters will see that we're well suited to each other. And those whose opinions don't matter can go to hell," he said bluntly, then softened. "Clara, I won't pretend that there won't be challenges. Some people will always find fault with choices that don't match their own narrow ideas of propriety. But this ranch, this life we're building, it's ours to define. The next few weeks passed in a flurry of quiet preparation. Clara altered one of Eleanor's dresses, a simple blue silk that had been packed away in tissue paper, transforming it into something that suited her own taste and figure. Maria threw herself into planning a wedding feast that would feed the ranch. Hans and the few neighbors whose friendship Elias valued. Word was sent to town for Reverend Miller to perform the ceremony, and Clara finally completed her letter to her cousins, explaining her circumstances and her decision with as much dignity as she could muster. The most meaningful preparation was the creation of the new brand iron. Elias worked with the ranch's blacksmith to design something elegant yet practical. The letters E and C intertwined within a circle, with Monroe spelled out beneath. When the finished product was presented to Clara, she ran her fingers along the smooth metal and felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. "It's beautiful," she said, though the word seemed inadequate for what the brand represented. "It's permanent," Elias replied, and Clara understood that he was talking about more than just marking livestock. The wedding itself was set for the first week of February, when the worst of the winter storms had passed, but spring was still a distant promise. Clara found herself looking forward to the ceremony with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that surprised her with its intensity. This marriage felt different from her union with Thomas, not the desperate grasping for security that Jacob Stern had tried to exploit, but a conscious choice made by two adults who understood both the possibilities and the limitations of what they were undertaking. It was during one of these final weeks of preparation that an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch, bringing news that would test their newfound partnership in ways neither had anticipated. Clara was in the kitchen with Maria, discussing the details of the wedding menu, when they heard the sound of horses approaching. Through the window, she could see a small group of riders making their way slowly through the snow toward the house. Something about their dejected posture and the condition of their mounts suggested travelers who had endured significant hardship. Elias emerged from the barn and approached the riders with the cautious hospitality of a man who had learned to be wary of strangers. Clara watched from the window as he spoke with the lead rider, saw his posture stiffen with what might have been recognition or alarm. When he finally came inside, his expression was grim. "Clara, you need to prepare yourself. We have visitors who claim to know you." Her heart sank as she recognized the implications. "From the wagon train." "What's left of it," Elias confirmed. "They say they've been searching for you since the river crossing, that they have urgent business to discuss." Clara straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she had forgotten she possessed. Whatever these people wanted, whatever claims they intended to make, she would face them as Elias's partner, rather than as the frightened, abandoned woman they had left to die in the wilderness. "Then we'll hear what they have to say," she said firmly. "Together." As she walked beside Elias toward the door, Clara found herself clutching the small bundle that contained her most precious possession, Thomas's pocket watch, which she had finally decided to put away as a symbol of her readiness to embrace the future rather than cling to the past. The weight of it in her hand reminded her of how far she had traveled, both physically and emotionally, since that terrible day by the river. The past was about to collide with the present and Clara Monroe, for she had already begun to think of herself by that name, was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The three survivors who stood in Elias Monroe's front parlor bore little resemblance to the confident settlers who had cast Clara out months earlier. Their clothes hung loose on gaunt frames. Their faces were weathered by hardship and marked by the hollow-eyed look of people who had seen too much death. Most shocking of all was the transformation in their leader. Jacob Stern was alive. Clara felt the blood drain from her face as she recognized the man she'd been told was dead, swept away by the very river he had insisted they cross. He stood before her now, his once robust frame reduced to sinew and bone, his beard grown wild and streaked with white, his eyes burning with the fervor of a man who had looked into the abyss and survived. "Hello, Clara," he said, his voice rougher. Then she remembered, but unmistakably his. "I told you we would meet again." Beside him stood Martha Caldwell, her kind face aged a decade in the months since Clara had seen her last. Her husband Henry was notably absent, and Clara noticed how Martha's eyes couldn't quite meet hers, suggesting guilt and shame that ran soul deep. The third survivor was Samuel Morrison, the scout whose son Timothy had shown Clara kindness during her final days with the wagon train. Morrison looked older and harder than before, his weathered face bearing fresh scars that spoke of violence encountered on the trail. "We were told you died in the river crossing," Clara said, finding her voice despite the shock of seeing these. "Ghosts from her past." "I nearly did," Stern replied, settling uninvited into one of Elias's chairs. "The water took me downstream for near a mile before I managed to grab hold of a fallen tree. By the time I worked my way back to shore, the crossing was over and half our people were dead." Elias remained standing, his hand resting casually on the mantelpiece, but positioned so that he could reach the rifle mounted there if necessary. Clara could feel the tension radiating from him, the protective instincts of a man who sensed danger to someone he cared about. "What do you want?" Elias asked bluntly, his tone making it clear that these visitors were not welcome. Martha Caldwell spoke for the first time, her voice trembling with exhaustion and something that might have been desperation. "We need help, Clara. After the crossing, after we lost so many, we've been wandering for months. Winter caught us unprepared and we've lost everything." "Everything except our legal rights," Stern added, his eyes fixed on Clara with uncomfortable intensity. "Rights that include certain claims on Mrs. Whitmore's person and property." Clara felt as if she had been struck. "What are you talking about?" Stern reached into his worn coat and produced a document that Clara recognized with growing horror, a contract she had signed back in Council Bluffs, agreeing to the terms of joining the wagon train. At the time, it had seemed like simple paperwork, a formality required of all travelers seeking the safety of the group. "According to this legally binding agreement," Stern continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man reading a verdict, "you contracted to provide domestic services to the wagon train in exchange for protection and transportation to Oregon Territory. The contract specifically states that failure to complete the journey releases you from obligation only upon payment of damages in the amount of $200. "That's preposterous," Elias said, his voice deadly quiet. "You abandoned her to die in the wilderness. Any contract was voided by your actions. We left her because she refused to fulfill her obligations," Stern replied smoothly. "The contract clearly states that willful disobedience or refusal to accept proper authority constitutes breach of agreement." Clara sank into a chair, her mind reeling as she tried to understand what was happening. "You're saying I owe you money?" "I'm saying you owe us service," Stern corrected, his smile cold as winter wind. $200, or equivalent work. At fair wages, given that a woman's domestic labor is worth perhaps $50 a year, you owe us 4 years of service. "This is madness," Elias snarled, taking a step toward Stern. "No court would uphold such a claim." "Wouldn't it?" Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice carrying bitter experience. "I've seen territorial courts enforce contracts that decent folks would call slavery. Law out here favors those who have documentation over those who have moral arguments." Martha Caldwell looked increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation progressed. "Jacob, perhaps we could discuss some other arrangement. Clara looks to be doing well here, and surely Clara is spoken for," Elias interrupted, his voice carrying absolute authority. "She's to be my wife in less than 2 weeks. Any claims you think you have are superseded by that relationship." Stern's eyes lit up with something that might have been triumph. "Ah, but that's where things become interesting. You see, Mr. Monroe, according to territorial law, A woman cannot enter into marriage while under legal obligation to fulfill a previous contract. Clara's engagement to you is invalid until her debt to us is satisfied. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the sound of Clara's heart pounding in her chest. She looked at Elias and saw her own horror reflected in his face, along with a rage that threatened to erupt into violence. "There's more," Stern continued, clearly savoring the moment. "I've done some research into you, Mr. Monroe. Successful. Wrencher, former cavalry officer, respected member of the community. But I've also learned about your late wife, Eleanor. Sweet girl by all accounts. Died 3 years ago under mysterious circumstances." Clara saw Elias's face go white, saw his hands clench into fists. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," Stern said with false reasonableness. "I'm simply noting that Eleanor Monroe died during an Indian raid that you somehow managed to survive unharmed. Raid that you claim came without warning, despite the fact that you had scouts and other security measures in place. The accusation hung in the air like poison." Clara felt sick as she began to understand what Stern was really saying, the monstrous suggestion he was making about Elias's role in his wife's death. Morrison stepped forward, his scarred face grave. "The thing is, Monroe, I was the scout who was supposed to warn you about that raid. Jacob here hired me away from that job with promises of better pay. By the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late." Clara felt the world tilt around her as the full scope of Stern's villainy became clear. He hadn't just abandoned her to die in the wilderness. He had been complicit in the death of Elias's first wife, part of a chain of events that had left Eleanor Monroe defenseless against raiders who should never have reached the ranch. "You bastard," Elias whispered, his voice shaking with rage and grief. "Eleanor died because of you." "Eleanor died because you failed to protect her," Stern replied coldly. "Just as you failed to protect your ranch hands, your livestock, everything. Else those raiders took. I merely created an opportunity for justice to take its course." The silence that followed was broken by Martha Caldwell's horrified gasp. "Jacob, you never told us. We didn't know." "There's a lot you didn't know," Stern said, his mask of reasonableness finally slipping to reveal the monster beneath. "Just as Clara didn't know that her precious Thomas didn't die of consumption. He died of poison, administered slowly over months by a wife who was tired of being married to a weak man." Clara shot to her feet, her face blazing with outrage. "That's a lie. Thomas was ill. He was ill because you made him ill," Stern continued relentlessly. "I have witnesses, Clara. People who remember how attentive you were to his medicine, how you insisted on preparing all his meals during his final weeks. People who wondered why a young woman would be so eager to nurse a husband she clearly didn't love. The accusation was so monstrous, so completely false, that Clara couldn't even find words to respond. She looked at Elias and saw doubt flickering in his eyes, the terrible possibility that everything he thought he knew about her might be a lie. "You're a sick man," she finally managed, her voice shaking with fury. "Thomas died of consumption. I nursed him because I cared about him, because it was my duty as his wife." "Perhaps," Stern agreed with a shrug, "but can you prove it? Can you provide witnesses to testify to your innocence? Remember, you'll be defending yourself in a territorial court where your word carries little weight against documented evidence." Clara felt trapped, surrounded by lies and half-truths that had been carefully constructed to destroy everything she had built. Stern had spent months planning this confrontation, gathering fragments of truth and weaving them into a web of accusations that would be difficult to disprove. "What do you want?" Elias asked quietly, his soldier's mind already working on the tactical aspects of their situation. "Simple," Stern replied, his confidence growing as he sensed victory. "Clara returns with us to fulfill her contract. 4 years of service, during which time she'll help us establish ourselves in Oregon Territory. In return, we'll say nothing about her suspicious devotion to her late husband's medicine, and nothing about your convenient survival when everyone else on your ranch died." Clara looked around the room at the faces of people she had once called friends, seeing how Stern's poison had worked its way into their minds. Martha couldn't Caldwell no longer meet her eyes, and even Morrison seemed to regard her with suspicion. "And if we refuse?" Elias asked. "Then we take our story to the territorial authorities and let them sort out the truth. Clara stands trial for murder, you stand trial for negligent homicide or worse, and your precious ranch becomes the property of the territory, while you both rot in prison." The choice Stern offered was no choice at all: submit to his demands or face ruin and possibly death. Clara felt the walls closing in around her, the careful life she had built crumbling under the weight of malicious lies. But as she looked at Elias, saw the pain and doubt in his eyes, Clara Monroe realized something important. She had survived abandonment, wilderness, starvation, and wolves. She had rebuilt her life from nothing and found love in the most unexpected place. She would not let Jacob Stern destroy her again. "No," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the room with surprising strength. Stern raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no," Clara repeated louder this time. "I won't go with you. I won't submit to your lies or your threats, and I won't let you destroy the life I've built here." "Then you've chosen poorly," Stern replied, but Clara thought she heard uncertainty in his voice for the first time. "Have I?" Clara asked, moving to stand beside Elias. "Because I think you've made a mistake, Jacob. You've assumed that I'm still the frightened woman you abandoned in the wilderness. But that woman died by the river. The woman standing before you now is someone different, someone stronger." She took Elias's hand, feeling his fingers close around hers with desperate strength. "And she's not alone anymore. The battle lines were drawn, and Clara Monroe was ready for war." The three unwelcome visitors departed the next morning with promises to return within a week with territorial authorities, leaving behind a poisonous atmosphere that seemed to contaminate everything in the house. Clara sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched coffee, while Maria bustled about with nervous energy, cleaning surfaces that were already spotless. "They're lying," Maria said, for the dozenth time since breakfast. "Anyone with eyes can see what kind of woman you are, child. That man Stern has the devil in him." Clara nodded absently, but her mind was focused on more practical concerns. Stern's accusations were lies, but they were cleverly constructed lies that would be difficult to disprove in a territorial court where documentation mattered more than character. She needed evidence, witnesses, proof that could stand up against Stern's manufactured claims. Elias had been unusually quiet since their visitors left, and Clara could see the doubt working at him like acid. He believed her protestations of innocence, but she could tell that Stern's words had found their mark, raising questions about things he had never thought to question before. "We need to talk," he said finally, appearing in the kitchen doorway. His face was haggard, as if he had aged years overnight. They walked together to the barn in silence, past the curious eyes of ranch hands who had heard enough of the previous night's conversation to know that trouble was brewing. Inside the barn, surrounded by the comfortable smell of hay and horses, Elias finally spoke. "Tell me about Thomas's illness," he said without preamble. "Everything from the beginning." Clara had expected this question, had been preparing for it since Stern's accusations. "It started with a cough," she said quietly. "Just a small thing. At first, the kind that comes with winter cold, but it never went away, and by spring it was worse. Then came the fever, the weight loss, the blood in his handkerchief." "Did you nurse him yourself?" "Of course I did. He was my husband, and we couldn't afford a doctor for every complaint." Clara's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining the obvious. "I made his meals, prepared his medicines, did everything I could to make him comfortable." "What kind of medicines?" Clara met his eyes steadily. "Willow bark tea for the fever, honey and whiskey for the cough, Broths to keep his strength up when he couldn't manage solid food. Everything my mother taught me about caring for the sick. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his soldier's mind working through the details. Stern said he has witnesses, people who remember your care of Thomas. Then he has people willing to lie for him, Clara replied firmly. Our nearest neighbors were miles away, and Thomas was sick for months before anyone else even knew the extent of his illness. By the time Dr. Whitman came out from town, Thomas was beyond help. Dr. Whitman, he examined Thomas? He did. Said it was consumption, same as dozens of other cases he'd seen. Asked if there was family history of lung disease. Clara's voice grew soft with memory. Thomas's father died of the same thing when Thomas was young. It runs in families, the doctor said. Elias absorbed this information with visible relief, but Clara could see that other doubts were still eating at him. She decided to address them directly. You're wondering about Eleanor, she said quietly. About whether Stern was telling the truth about the raid. His face went white. Clara, It's all right, she interrupted. You have a right to know what kind of woman you're planning to marry. Ask me anything you need to ask. Did you know? About Morrison being hired away, about the warning that never came? I knew nothing about Eleanor until you told me yourself, Clara replied honestly. But the moment Stern started talking last night, I could see the pattern. He's been planning this for a long time, Elias. The abandonment, the accusations, even Eleanor's death, it's all connected to his obsession with controlling me. Elias turned away. His hands clenched into fists. She died because of me, because I wasn't careful. Enough wasn't suspicious enough of a man offering good money for my scout services. She died because Jacob Stern is evil, Clara corrected firmly. You couldn't have known what he was planning. No decent person could have imagined such calculated cruelty. But if I had been more careful, if, Clara interrupted, her voice sharp with frustration. You could spend the rest of your life torturing yourself with if, or you could focus on what we need to do now to stop him from hurting anyone else. Elias looked at her with something approaching wonder. How are you so calm about this? He's threatening to destroy both our lives. Because I've been where he wants to put me, Clara replied simply. I've been alone, abandoned, left for dead. I know what it's like to have nothing left to lose, and I know that sometimes the only way through hell is to keep walking. That afternoon they began their strategic planning in earnest. Elias sent riders to town with messages for his lawyer and for Dr. Whitman, hoping to gather documentation that could counter Stern's claims. Clara wrote careful letters to people back in Iowa who had known her and Thomas, asking for written testimony about her character and her husband's illness. We need to be prepared for the possibility that legal channels won't be enough, Elias said as they sat in his study, surrounded by papers and plans. Stern has had months to prepare his case. He may have bribed officials, fabricated documents, created a web of lies that will be impossible to untangle in time. Clara looked up from the letter she was writing. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we consider all our options, Elias replied carefully. I have men who are loyal to me, men who understand that sometimes justice requires action outside the law. You're talking about vigilante violence. I'm talking about protecting what's ours, Elias corrected. Stern destroyed my first marriage and killed my wife. I won't let him destroy my second chance at happiness. Clara set down her pen and studied his face, seeing the soldier beneath the rancher's facade. And what would that make us? How would we be different from him if we resort to murder to solve our problems? We would be protecting innocent people from a man who has proven he's willing to kill to get what he wants. And we would be becoming killers ourselves, Clara replied quietly. I won't have that on my conscience, Elias. I won't let Jacob Stern turn us into monsters. Their philosophical disagreement was interrupted by the arrival of one of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete, who had ridden hard from town with news. Mr. Monroe, he said, his face flushed with excitement and worry. Judge Harrison is in. Town, holding court for the week. Word is that Stern and his people met with him this morning, filed formal complaints. Elias cursed under his breath. Judge Harrison was known for his strict interpretation of contract law and his suspicion of anything that smacked of moral rather than legal arguments. If Stern had gotten to him first, had presented his fabricated case without opposition, it would be difficult to undo the damage. There's more, Pete continued. Sheriff Williams wants to see you both in town tomorrow morning. Says it's official business that can't wait. After Pete left, Clara and Elias sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The legal system was moving faster than they had anticipated, and their careful preparations might not be enough to counter Stern's lies. "We could run," Elias said quietly. "Take the horses and head for California. Start over somewhere he can't find us." Clara considered the suggestion seriously, weighing the appeal of escape against the cost of abandoning everything they had built. "And spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, always wondering when the past would catch up with us? Better than spending them in prison or dead." "Is it?" Clara asked. "What kind of life would that be, Elias? What kind of marriage could we build on running away from our problems?" Elias looked around his study, taking in the books and papers and personal items that represented years of hard work and careful building. "This ranch is everything I've worked for, everything I am, and I'm asking you to risk it all for me," Clara said quietly. "A woman you've known for less than 6 months, who brought nothing but trouble to your door." "You brought hope to my door," Elias corrected, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You brought laughter and warmth and the possibility of a future I thought was lost forever. That's worth fighting for." Clara squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his touch. "Then we fight. Not with guns and violence, but with truth and courage and the support of people who know who we really are. And if that's not enough," Clara met his eyes steadily, "then we face whatever comes together. That's what partners do." That evening, they called a meeting of the ranch hands and explained the situation as honestly as they could, without going into all the sordid details. The response was immediate and unanimous. Every man on the ranch pledged his support, offering to testify on their behalf or provide whatever help was needed. "You've been fair to us, Mr. Monroe," said Tom Bradley, the ranch foreman. "Never cheated us on wages. Never asked us to do anything dishonest. And Mrs. Whitmore has been a blessing to this place. We won't see you folks wronged by some lying snake." Similar messages arrived from neighbors throughout the evening, people who had known Elias for years and had come to respect Clara in the months since her arrival. Even Ben Hartley, who had been suspicious of their arrangement, sent word that he would speak for their character if needed. As Clara prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking about the long journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been a frightened widow, dependent on the charity of strangers and vulnerable to the whims of cruel men. Now she was a woman with a home, a future, and people willing to fight for her. The old Clara might have submitted to Stern's demands, might have accepted that her fate was in the hands of more powerful people. But the woman who looked back at her from the mirror was someone different, someone who had learned that strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from walking through it with dignity intact. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation with Sheriff Williams and Judge Harrison, the first real test of whether truth would triumph over carefully constructed lies. Clara Monroe smoothed her hair and checked her appearance one final time, preparing for battle. She had faced wolves in the wilderness and survived. She had faced abandonment and starvation and the crushing weight of solitude. Now she would face Jacob Stern and his accusations with the same courage that had carried her through every other trial. Some fights were worth having, no matter the cost. This was one of them. The war for her future was about to begin. The courthouse in Bear Valley was a modest wooden structure that served the scattered ranches and mining camps of the territory, but on this cold February morning it felt as imposing as any cathedral. Clara walked through its doors with Elias beside her, both dressed in their finest clothes and carrying themselves with the dignity of people who had nothing to hide. Judge Harrison presided from behind a scarred oak desk that had seen decades of frontier justice. He was a thin, severe man with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, known throughout the territory for his adherence to the letter of the law, regardless of personal sentiment. Sheriff Williams stood nearby, his weather-beaten face carefully neutral. As he watched the proceedings, Jacob Stern sat at a table across the room, with Martha Caldwell and Samuel Morrison flanking him like reluctant sentries. Stern had cleaned himself up for the occasion, trimming his wild beard and donning what appeared to be a borrowed suit. But Clara could still see the fanatic gleam in his eyes that marked him as a man who had crossed lines from which there was no return. This court is convened to hear complaints filed by Mr. Jacob Stern regarding breach of contract and other matters, Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of frontier law. Mr. Stern, present your case. Stern rose with theatrical dignity, producing the contract that Clara remembered signing what felt like a lifetime ago. Your Honor, Mrs. Clara Whitmore entered into a legally binding agreement to provide domestic services to our wagon train in exchange for safe passage to Oregon Territory. She willfully broke that contract through disobedience and refusal to accept proper authority. What form did this disobedience take? Harrison asked, studying the document with careful attention. She refused my offer of marriage and protection, Stern replied smoothly. When I explained that a woman traveling alone posed a danger to the entire group, she became defiant and disruptive. I was forced to leave her behind for the safety of the other travelers. Clara felt her jaw clench at this sanitized version of events, but Elias's gentle pressure on her arm reminded her to remain silent until called upon to speak. Furthermore, Stern continued, warming to his theme, I have reason to believe that Mrs. Whitmore has a history of violence toward those closest to her. Her late husband died under suspicious circumstances with Mrs. Whitmore as his sole caregiver during his final illness. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Stern. Do you have evidence to support such a claim? I have witnesses who remember her unusual devotion to preparing her husband's medicines, her insistence on caring for him without outside help, and the convenient timing of his death just before their creditors could foreclose on their property. Martha Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and Clara could see the woman's conscience warring with whatever hold Stern had over her. Morrison remained stone-faced, but his eyes avoided meeting Clara's gaze. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Harrison said, turning his attention to Clara, how do you respond to these charges? Clara rose gracefully, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Your Honor, Mr. Stern's version of events bears little resemblance to the truth. I was abandoned by the wagon train not for disobedience but for refusing to submit to Mr. Stern's unwelcome advances. As for my husband's death, Thomas Whitmore died of consumption after a long illness, attended by Dr. Whitman of Cedar Falls, Iowa. She produced a letter from her reticule, one of several that had arrived by express rider the previous evening. This is a statement from Dr. Whitman confirming the cause of death and attesting to my character during my husband's illness. Stern's confidence flickered slightly as Harrison examined the document, but he recovered quickly. Doctors can be mistaken, Your Honor, and letters can be forged by those with sufficient motivation. Are you suggesting that Mrs. Whitmore has committed fraud in addition to her other alleged crimes? Harrison asked sharply. I'm suggesting that a woman capable of murder would not hesitate to commit lesser crimes to cover her tracks. Stern replied. The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Clara felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom upon her, weighing and judging, looking for signs of guilt in her expression. She forced herself to remain calm, to meet their gazes with the steady confidence of innocence. Your Honor, Elias said, rising to stand beside Clara, I must object to Mr. Stern's unfounded accusations. Mrs. Whitmore has been a guest in my home for months, and I have seen nothing but integrity and kindness in her character. Mr. Monroe, Harrison said, while your personal observations are noted, they do not constitute legal evidence. Mr. Stern, do you have any documentation to support your claims about Mrs. Whitmore's husband's death? Stern hesitated for the first time, and Clara sensed weakness in his position. The evidence is circumstantial, Your Honor, but compelling. A pattern of behavior that suggests nothing but a grieving widow's devotion to her dying husband, interrupted a new voice from the back of the courtroom. Every head turned to see Dr. Whitman himself walking through the doors, travel-stained and clearly exhausted from a hard journey. Clara's heart leapt with hope as she recognized the elderly physician who had attended Thomas during his final weeks. Dr. Whitman, Harrison said with surprise, this is unexpected. I received Mrs. Whitmore's letter requesting a statement about her husband's condition, Dr. Whitman replied, removing his hat and approaching the bench. Given the seriousness of the accusations being made, I felt it necessary to come in person to set the record straight. Stern's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. Your Honor, this man's sudden appearance is convenient to the point of suspicion. How do we know he is who he claims to be? Because I know him personally, Sheriff Williams spoke for the first time, his voice carrying quiet authority. Dr. Whitman delivered my youngest son and treated my wife through her difficult recovery. He's been practicing medicine in Iowa for 30 years. Harrison nodded approvingly. Dr. Whitman, please tell the court about your treatment of Thomas Whitmore. The elderly doctor cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority. Thomas Whitmore suffered from pulmonary consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. It's a wasting disease that affects the lungs, causing persistent cough, fever, weight loss, and eventual death. I treated Mr. Whitmore during his final months and can state unequivocally that his death was due to natural causes. What role did Mrs. Whitmore play in his care? Harrison asked. She was a devoted and capable nurse, Dr. Whitman replied. She followed my instructions precisely, administered medicines as directed, and provided the kind of compassionate care that can ease suffering even when it cannot prevent death. Her husband was fortunate to have such a wife during his final ordeal. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at this public vindication of her care for Thomas. Across the room, she could see Stern's confidence crumbling as his carefully constructed lies collided with professional testimony. Furthermore, Dr. Whitman continued, consumption is not uncommon in farming families. Thomas's father died of the same disease, as did his uncle. There was nothing suspicious about the progression of the illness or the circumstances of death. Stern made one last, desperate attempt to salvage his position. Your Honor, even if we accept Dr. Whitman's testimony about her husband's death, the fact remains that Mrs. Whitmore broke her contract with our wagon train. She owes compensation for that breach. Let's examine that contract, Harrison said, beckoning for the document. As the judge studied the papers, Clara noticed Morrison shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The scout kept glancing toward the door as if calculating his chances of escape, and she began to suspect that Stern's hold over his companions was not as secure as it appeared. This contract, Harrison said finally, appears to be a standard agreement for wagon train participation. However, Mr. Stern, I note that you signed as wagon master, but there's no documentation establishing your authority to make binding agreements on behalf of the entire group. I was elected leader by common consent, Stern protested. Can you provide witnesses to this election, minutes of the meeting, any documentation of the democratic process by which you assumed authority? Stern's silence was answer enough. Clara watched with growing hope as the legal foundation of his case continued to erode under Harrison's careful questioning. Moreover, Harrison continued, even if we accept your authority as wagon master, the contract contains a clause stating that services are contingent upon safe passage and proper protection. If you abandon Mrs. Whitmore in the wilderness, you breached the contract first, voiding any obligations on her part. The judge set the papers aside and fixed Stern with a steady stare. Mr. Stern, your complaints appear to be without legal merit. The contract you cite does not support your claims, and your accusations regarding Mrs. Whitmore's character have been thoroughly refuted by credible medical testimony. Clara felt a surge of relief so powerful it left her dizzy, but she could see that Stern was not finished. The desperate look in his eyes suggested a man with nothing left to lose, and such men were often the most dangerous. "Your Honor," Stern said, his voice taking on a tone of injured righteousness, "if the law will not provide justice, then perhaps Mrs. Whitmore would be willing to settle this matter privately. I'm prepared to forget these disputes in exchange for a modest compensation, say $100, and a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing." Clara felt Elias tense beside her, recognized the trap that Stern was laying. Any payment, any admission of guilt would be seen as validation of his claims, regardless of what the judge had ruled. "I have done nothing wrong," Clara said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "I will not pay compensation for defending my honor, and I will not apologize for refusing to submit to improper advances." Stern's mask of civility finally slipped completely, revealing the hatred beneath. "Then you've made your choice, Mrs. Whitmore, but this isn't over, not by a long shot." The threat was clear to everyone present, and Clara saw Sheriff Williams move slightly closer to Stern's table. The legal battle might be won, but she sensed that the real war was just beginning. The confrontation Judge Harrison had hoped to avoid erupted the moment court was dismissed. Stern rose from his chair with the jerky movements of a man whose carefully laid plans had crumbled to dust, his eyes fixed on Clara with a hatred so pure it seemed to radiate heat. "This isn't justice," he snarled, loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. "This is a rich man buying his way out of consequences with lawyers and convenient witnesses." Sheriff Williams stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun. "Mr. Stern, I suggest you accept the judge's ruling and move along. There's nothing more for you here." "Nothing more?" Stern's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "I've lost everything because of that woman, my wagon train, my people, my future. Everything I worked for, destroyed by her selfishness," Clara found, her voice drawing on reserves of strength she was still discovering. "You destroyed yourself, Jacob. You chose cruelty over kindness, control over compassion. The consequences are your own responsibility." Responsibility. Stern stepped closer, forcing Sheriff Williams to move between them. "You want to talk about responsibility? Let me tell you about Samuel Morrison's boy, Timothy. Remember him, Clara? Kind boy, always had a smile for you?" Clara's heart clenched as she remembered the 15-year-old who had shown her compassion during her final days with the wagon train. "What about Timothy? He died in the river crossing," Stern said with cruel satisfaction. "Swept away trying to save the Morrison family's possessions. Died because we were forced to take a dangerous route after you disrupted our leadership." Samuel Morrison finally found his voice, rising from his chair with tears streaming down his weathered face. "That's enough, Jacob. Timothy died because you insisted on crossing a river that any fool could see was running too high and fast. Don't you dare blame Clara for your arrogance." The scout's words seemed to release something in Martha Caldwell as well. "This has gone too far," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "Henry is dead. Timothy is dead. 7 others are. Dead because you wouldn't listen to reason. I won't be part of your vendetta anymore." Stern whirled on his former companions with fury in his eyes. "Cowards, both of you! After everything I've done, everything I've sacrificed, everything you've destroyed," Morrison corrected, his grief transforming into anger. "My boy trusted you, followed your orders, and died for it. I won't help you hurt another innocent person." Clara watched the confrontation with a mixture of relief and sorrow, seeing how Stern's obsession had poisoned everything he touched. Even his own supporters were turning away from him, finally recognizing the monster he had become. "Mrs. Caldwell, Mr. Morrison," Judge Harrison said firmly, "I suggest you both consider returning to whatever family you have left. This territory has no place for those who would pursue innocent people with false accusations." Martha Caldwell nodded gratefully, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. "We have a sister in Denver. We'll head there come spring." She looked at Clara with eyes full of shame and regret. "I'm sorry, Clara, for everything. You deserved better from us. You were frightened and grieving," Clara replied gently. "I understand." Morrison lingered for a moment longer, his face etched with the pain of loss. "For what it's worth, my boy liked you, said you were the only one who treated him like he had sense instead of like a child to be ordered about." As the two survivors of the wagon train gathered their few possessions and prepared to leave, Stern found himself increasingly isolated. Sheriff Williams maintained his position between Stern and Clara, but Clara could see the calculation in Stern's eyes, the desperate measures of a man with nothing left to lose. "Jacob Stern," Clara said quietly, taking a step forward despite Elias's restraining hand on her arm. "This ends here. You've lost your case. Your supporters have abandoned. You and your lies have been exposed. Walk away now and try to build something better with what remains of your life." Stern's response was a laugh that held no humor, only madness. "Walk away? To what? I have nothing left because of you. No money, no prospects, no future. You destroyed everything when you refused to accept your place." "I didn't destroy anything," Clara replied firmly. "I simply refused to be destroyed myself." "Then we're at an impasse," Stern said, his hand moving toward his coat, "because I won't let you win. I won't let you live happily ever after while I rot in poverty and shame." The movement was subtle, but Sheriff Williams caught it immediately. "Easy there, Stern. Don't make this worse than it already is." "Worse?" Stern's eyes were wild now, the facade of civilization completely stripped away. "How could it be worse? I've lost everything that mattered to me. What's left but revenge?" He lunged forward with surprising speed, a knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. Sheriff Williams moved to intercept him, but Stern was driven by desperation and madness that gave him strength beyond reason. Clara threw herself sideways as the blade swept through the air where she had been standing, crashing into a wooden bench with enough force to drive the breath from her lungs. She heard Elias shout her name, heard the sound of struggle as multiple men tried to subdue Stern's frantic attack. "She ruined everything!" Stern screamed as he fought against the hands trying to restrain him. "Everything I worked for! Everything! I planned! She has to pay!" Clara struggled to her feet, her shoulder aching from the impact but her spirit unbroken. Looking at Stern as Sheriff Williams finally managed to disarm him, she felt not fear but profound sadness for a man who had destroyed himself through his own choices. "Jacob," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying over the chaos. "Look at yourself. Look what your hatred has made you become." For a moment, Stern stopped struggling, his wild eyes focusing on her face. Clara saw a flicker of the man he might have been, proud, capable, perhaps even decent once upon a time. But that man had been consumed by bitterness and the need to control others, leaving only this broken remnant. "I could have given you everything," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and defeat. "Security, protection, a place in the world. All you had to do was submit and lose myself in the process." Clara replied, "That's not a trade I was willing to make." Sheriff Williams clicked handcuffs around Stern's wrists with professional efficiency. "Jacob Stern, you're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon and disturbing the peace. You'll be held pending trial." As Williams led Stern away, the broken man turned back one final time. "This isn't over, Clara. Even from prison, even from the grave, I'll find a way to make you pay." "It is over," Clara said with quiet finality. "Your power over me ended the moment I chose to fight back. instead of submit. The courtroom gradually emptied, leaving Clara and Elias alone with the aftermath of violence and vindication. Clara sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted by the emotional toll of the confrontation. "Are you hurt?" Elias asked, kneeling beside her chair with gentle hands examining her shoulder. "Bruised, but not broken," Clara replied, managing a shaky smile, rather like everything else about this experience. Elias helped her to her feet, his arms coming around her with protective tenderness. "It's over, Clara. Really over this time." "Yes," she agreed, leaning into his strength. "Jacob Stern can't hurt us anymore." As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Clara caught sight of herself in a mirror near the door. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened widow who had been abandoned in the wilderness months earlier. This woman's eyes held confidence and strength, the knowledge that she had faced her demons and emerged victorious. The testimony letter she had read aloud, bearing witness to her own truth and courage, had become more than just evidence. It had been a declaration of independence, a statement that Clara Monroe would never again allow others to define her worth or determine her fate. Outside, the February sun was shining with unusual warmth, melting the snow from the courthouse steps and suggesting that spring might be closer than expected. Clara took Elias's arm and walked with him toward their waiting wagon, ready to return to the ranch they would now truly call home. The battle was won. The war was over, and Clara Monroe was free. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow in gentle stages and revealing a world transformed. Clara stood on the porch of what was now truly her home, watching the morning sun paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold, while steam rose from her coffee cup in the crisp air. The wedding rings on her finger caught the light, simple bands forged by the local blacksmith, as she and Elias had planned, representing not passionate romance, but something deeper and more enduring. Their wedding had taken place just 2 weeks. After the courthouse confrontation, a simple ceremony attended by ranch hands, neighbors, and the few people whose friendship had proven genuine during their time of trial. Dr. Whitman had stayed for the occasion, pronouncing it one of the most sensible matches he had witnessed in his long career. "Two people who know their own minds and respect each other's character," he had observed. "That's a foundation that will weather any storm." The ceremony itself had been everything Clara could have wished: dignified, heartfelt, and focused on. The promises two mature people made to each other about building a life together. When Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Clara felt not the giddy excitement of young love, but something more precious, the deep satisfaction of knowing she had found her place in the world. The months that followed had proven the wisdom of their partnership. Spring brought the seasonal challenges of ranch life: calving season, fence repairs, the endless work of maintaining buildings and equipment. Clara threw herself into these tasks with enthusiasm, discovering abilities she hadn't known she possessed. She proved to have an intuitive understanding of cattle behavior and a knack for organization that streamlined the ranch's operations in ways both large and small. Most satisfying of all was her work with Belle, Eleanor's horse. Under Clara's patient care, the mare had regained her spirit and strength, becoming not just a means of transportation, but a genuine companion. Clara often rode the boundaries of their property, checking on cattle and simply enjoying the vast beauty of the land they now shared. These solitary rides had become a form of meditation, moments when she could reflect on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this place. The new brand iron had been put to use in the spring roundup, marking the calves with the intertwined initials that proclaimed their partnership to the world. Clara had insisted on helping with the branding, wanting to participate in this symbolic claiming of their shared future. The work was hard and sometimes dangerous, but she found deep satisfaction in the rhythm of it, in being part of something larger than herself. News had reached them that Jacob Stern had been sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison for assault and various other charges that had emerged during his trial. Martha Caldwell and Samuel Morrison had indeed traveled to Denver, where Martha's sister had welcomed them into her household. Morrison had sent a letter of gratitude to Clara, thanking her for helping him find the courage to break free from Stern's influence. On this particular morning, Clara was expecting visitors, her cousins from Portland, who had finally responded to her letters with news that they were traveling east on business and hoped to meet her new husband. She felt nervous about the encounter, uncertain how her relatives would judge the choices she had made and the life she had built. "They'll love you," Elias said, emerging from the house with his own coffee cup and settling into the chair beside hers. "How could they not? They might think I've become too independent, too far removed from proper feminine behavior," Clara replied, though her tone suggested she cared less about their opinion than she once might have. "Then they don't know the woman I married," Elias observed, "the woman who faced down a madman in court and rebuilt her life from nothing." Clara smiled at the memory. In the months since the trial, she had received letters from other women who had heard her story, some seeking advice about escaping difficult situations, others simply wanting to express their admiration for her courage. She had answered each, one thoughtfully, sharing what wisdom she had gained about the importance of refusing to be defined by others' expectations. "I've been thinking about starting a correspondence circle," she told Elias. "Women throughout the territory who could support each other, share experiences and advice. There are so many isolated ranches and mining camps where women face challenges alone." "That sounds like something you'd be good at," Elias agreed. "You have a gift for seeing people clearly and helping them find their strength." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A small carriage came into view, followed by a single rider who proved to be Tom Bradley, their ranch foreman, evidently serving as escort. The carriage contained a middle-aged couple who bore enough resemblance to Clara to mark them clearly as relatives. "Well," Clara said, rising to greet her visitors, "here we go." The reunion proved more comfortable than Clara had dared to hope. Her cousin Margaret was a practical woman who appreciated the improvements Clara had made to the ranch house, while Margaret's husband Paul showed genuine interest in Elias's cattle operation and business methods. They stayed for 3 days, during which Clara found herself enjoying their company while also recognizing how much she had changed since leaving Iowa. "You've found your place," Margaret observed on their final evening as the women sat on the porch while their husbands discussed cattle prices. "I remember how restless you always seemed as a girl, like you were waiting for your real life to begin." "Perhaps I was," Clara replied thoughtfully. "I just never imagined it would begin with being abandoned in the wilderness." "God works in mysterious ways," Margaret said, "though I suspect he had considerable help from your own stubborn determination to survive." After her cousins departed, Clara found herself reflecting on the observation. She had indeed found her place, but more than that, she had discovered who she was when all external supports were stripped away. The woman who had emerged from that wilderness ordeal was someone she was proud to be. The summer passed in a blur of productive activity. The ranch prospered under their joint management, with Clara's organizational skills complementing Elias's experience and knowledge. They began making plans for expansion, additional acreage, improvements to the breeding program, perhaps even branching into other livestock. More importantly, they had settled into the rhythm of a partnership that worked. They consulted each other on major decisions, but trusted each other's judgment in their respective areas of expertise. Their conversations ranged from practical matters of ranch management to deeper discussions about their hopes for the future, their understanding of each other deepening with each passing day. It was during one of their evening talks that Elias made an observation that surprised Clara with its insight. "You know," he said as they sat before the fire with the comfortable ease of long companionship, "I think I understand now why my marriage to Eleanor struggled and why ours works so well." "Oh?" Clara looked up from her mending, curious to hear his thoughts. Eleanor and I were trying to fit ourselves into roles we thought we should play, the protective husband and the delicate wife. We were performing marriage rather than living it. He paused, choosing his words carefully. With you, I don't feel like I'm playing a role. I'm just being myself, and you're being yourself, and somehow that creates something stronger than either of us could manage alone. Clara set aside her sewing and moved to sit beside him on the settee they had purchased together in town. I think you're right. Thomas and I had a similar problem. We were both trying so hard to be good at being married that we forgot to actually be married. And now I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, with exactly the right person. Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. It's not the romantic love that poets write about, but it's something better. It's real. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors and the first light snows began to dust the peaks, Clara received a letter that brought unexpected news. Dr. Whitman wrote to inform her that Jacob Stern had died in prison, victim of a fever that had swept through the facility. The news stirred complicated emotions, relief that the threat was finally ended, sadness for a life so thoroughly wasted, and gratitude that she had escaped a similar fate. "Do you feel guilty for not mourning him?" Elias asked when she shared the news. "No," Clara replied after considering the question seriously. "I feel sorry for the man he might have been, but I can't mourn the man he chose to become. Some people use their hardships as excuses to hurt others. Others use them as opportunities to grow stronger. Jacob made his choice." Winter settled over the ranch with familiar routine, but this year Clara faced it without fear or uncertainty. She had proved to herself that she could handle whatever challenges arose, and she had a partner who valued her strength rather than seeking to diminish it. On Christmas morning, as snow fell gently outside their windows and the smell of Maria's cooking filled the house, Clara found herself thinking about the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 18 months ago, she had been a frightened widow dependent on the charity of strangers. Now she was a ranch wife, a business partner, a woman who had found her voice and learned to use it. "Any regrets?" Elias asked, following her gaze toward the window where Belle grazed peacefully in the snow-covered pasture. Clara considered the question seriously, as she considered all important questions. The path that had led her here had been painful and difficult, marked by loss and hardship and moments of genuine terror, but it had also been the path that had revealed her true strength and brought her to this place of belonging. "None," she said finally, "not even the parts that hurt. They all led me here, to this life, to you, to the person I've become. I wouldn't change any of it." As the winter sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Clara Monroe stood in the home she had helped build and looked toward a future that was entirely her own creation. She had been left for dead by people who saw her only as an inconvenience, but she had been rescued not just by a wealthy cowboy, but by her own courage and determination to survive. The woman who had nearly died beside a Montana river had, indeed, been reborn, not as someone's dependent or burden, but as a partner, a force, a person whose life had meaning beyond what others chose to grant her. And in finding that strength, she had also found love of the truest kind, not the desperate need for rescue, but the deep satisfaction of standing beside someone who saw her clearly and valued what he saw. Some stories end with dramatic declarations of passion. This one ended with something better, the quiet contentment of two people who had found in each other not just love, but home.